there have been within the classified programs a parallel development in the biological sciences that have been classified. And these include the ability to take genetic material and clone life. Now, everyone thinks that Dolly the sheep or whatever in Scotland back a few years ago was the first cloned higher life form or mammal. This is not true. It was being done in, sort of paging Dr. Mengele, wild mad scientist programs way back, and for decades. And these programs, which have been centered in some of the underground bases in the United States and Australia and England and a few other places, have been using very advanced electronics to modify or to create artificial biological life forms, some of which have integrated circuits and computerized programs in their neural complex, including their central nervous system. And they have also developed radio frequency chips. In the UFO subculture, these are called implants that are from the aliens. Well, they're not from the aliens, and they are implants, but I know where they're being manufactured. And they're very much being manufactured right here on Earth by a company that I'm quite aware of who they are. And so I think that the advances that have happened from the 40s until now that have been in the biological and in the electromagnetic realms, unless you have an ability to penetrate those programs, and the one fortunate thing about the Disclosure Project, and you can go to disclosureproject.org and see this, is that we have now over 500 top-secret military and corporate and intelligence witnesses who have been in these projects, who have given me documents and information and intelligence and corroborating data about this sort of thing. And I think that unless you study that, you really can't differentiate between, is something actually an extraterrestrial sighting or event, or is it man-made, but looks a heck of a lot like an extraterrestrial event. I recently was with a major Hollywood filmmaker who had been approached by the CIA anyway, the CIA often approaches the big Hollywood guys as well as people in the media to do stories or to do certain movies that advance the agenda they want advanced. And he started looking into this subject. And what he found, he was actually out at one point in the mountains outside Salt Lake City, south of Salt Lake City, not far from Provo, Utah. And this was a few years ago. And he saw this, in broad daylight, this strange levitating bell-shaped or disc-shaped craft. But he said that it had rivets and seams and this and that, and it was very clunky. He knew immediately it was man-made, but it looked like an ET spacecraft. And if he hadn't seen it very up close, he would have thought it was, I saw a UFO. And he started sharing this with me. Now, this same film director had seen some years ago an actual extraterrestrial vehicle, which was very luminous, seamless, had an amazing energy and a very spiritual consciousness about it. And he could tell the difference immediately between this ARV, or alien reproduction vehicle, that's made by a consortium of companies that include Lockheed Martin and Northrop and EG&G and Raytheon and E-Systems and Science Applications International Corporation, et cetera, and the real extraterrestrial vehicles. But to a casual observer who wouldn't know that there are actual man-made things that look like flying saucers, they would be completely deceived. And so he and I started discussing this, and I said, well, yes, I'm glad that you at least have this level of understanding. Now do you understand also that there are biologicals that look like little ETs, that look like little grays, these little scary things, that look like an extraterrestrial but are man-made? And he had no idea. And I said, oh, well, here's a good recent case. In the last year, I believe it was last summer, there was a man who was a very nice man that I got to know named Stan Romanek, who is in Colorado. And his father had been in a top secret Air Force compartment that I'm pretty sure was dealing with this issue. And he began to have some experiences that were really pretty scary. And he actually had an abduction type experience happen in his home, and he was able to film this creature that he calls the grandpa creature, but it looks like one of these big-eyed, what people would consider a gray or what have you. And he passed out in the middle of trying to film this and then awakened, and he had some kind of abduction thing happen that he recalled. Well, there were some people in the intelligence community who apparently had been friendly with his father or some kind of connection that were trying to warn him about all of this that was happening, that he was a guinea pig in a disinformation and propaganda program. And he got a call the next day, and I heard this personally, and I saw this film personally. And so did a long-standing member of our team, Ricky Butterfass in Denver, who was with me at this meeting. And the call said that was one of the fake ones. That was a fake one. And they tossed a chemical canister in your kitchen, and that's why you passed out. And there was a certain chemical that caused you to become unconscious. And he didn't know what any of that meant. And I said, well, the fake one they're referring to is this one you have on the camera that everyone who would see it would say, oh, my God, there's one of the grays. Or they could have one that would look like one of the reptilians. And I'm going, the fake ones just means those are the ones that are man-made, that are these PLFs, program life forms. And there were all these UFO researchers, quote unquote, who were with him. None of them had ever heard this. I said, you're kidding. This is like UFO Studies 101. This is the first level. This is the first course you should learn if you're going to look into this, is the extent to which the intelligence community has mastered the ability to hoax this stuff to scare the bejeebies out of people. But none of them knew this. And I said, well, you really need to look at some of the work that was done in the 1980s, 20 years ago, by Martin Cannon. And Martin Cannon had assembled, and when I spoke to him back in the 90s, some over 2,000 references about the military, paramilitary involvement with human abductions so that it would look alien but isn't. Now, I'll give you another really great example, the Paul Benowitz affair, and you can Google this. And Paul Benowitz was a UFO researcher in New Mexico some years ago, and he was investigating an experience that a woman had had near Kirkland Air Force Base in Sandia out there near Albuquerque. And she had been driving wee hours of the morning and saw something she was not supposed to see, apparently an alien reproduction vehicle or a man-made UFO that was coming in to that area very late at night. And she was stopped on a road near the base. Something was sprayed in her face. She was then, quote, abducted by, quote, unquote, aliens and then put back in her vehicle. Now, Paul Benowitz, when he started looking into this, was being fed a lot of disinformation by an AFOSI, that's Air Force Office of Special Investigations, officer named Richard Doty, D-O-T-Y. And I have documents, by the way, about this case. Now, Paul Benowitz thought that she had actually had an extraterrestrial encounter. What they had done is fake an extraterrestrial encounter because they wanted her to have that as the cover story to tell this UFO researcher so that she wouldn't relate the fact that she had seen a secret human anti-gravity flying disc. And that's what a lot of this is that they will make up those kind of stories as a cover story to hide the really top-secret Air Force and top-secret craft that are being made very much by humans. And so I don't know if I'm confusing people now, but you have to go through a level of education on this, and if you don't, you're going to be a sitting duck for the kind of propaganda that they're going to pour out through the public and use that propaganda to scare the hell out of people. I'll give you one more example. And this is a case where something wonderful was portrayed as something terrible. Years ago, and this is in Linda's home state of Arizona, there was a man named Travis Walton. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of his case, and I know the man, and I've read his memoirs, but he was a lumberjack, and he was with some buddies one night driving in a forest up in, I believe, northern Arizona, and he saw this light in the woods, and they got closer, and there was this craft hovering in the woods. And he ran under to it and got, and the people were saying, come back, and apparently when an ET craft is fully materialized, they put out gigawatts of electrical power because they're drawing energy from this zero-point energy field, and between the dampness of the forest and the electricity from this craft, he accidentally got hit by an electrostatic discharge. It looked like a bolt of lightning, knocked him back quite a few feet. I suspect, as a trauma doctor myself, that it probably caused his heart to go into fibrillation, which means that it made his heart stop. And that often happens with lightning strikes and electrocutions. Any of you who've ever taken care of someone medically who've had a sort of a high voltage discharge. So he was taken on board this craft and then went out into space where it docked with a larger sort of mothership. And he was cared for and medically stabilized. And he, at one point, when he awakened and saw these ETs taking care of him, jumped up off of a table and took some instruments and tried to attack the ETs. He admits this. He was so freaked out. And so they had to restrain him. But after he calmed down later, and this was a 5-day period that he was on this ship, by the way, they let him come up to the central part of the craft and actually let him sit in the pilot's or the commander's seat and kind of steer it and fly this craft out in space. And it was just a beautiful experience of compassion where they saved his life and brought him back on the ship. And then they returned him near the town where he grew up or where his home was about 5 days later. Well, they made a movie some years ago, and many of you may have seen it, called Fire in the Sky. And it portrays a death ray from the craft hitting him, and then he was abducted, and then he was tortured with drills going into his eyes and into his brains on this ship. Everything it portrayed in that movie was false. Everything. And Hollywood took this guy's beautiful story of having been saved and resuscitated by the extraterrestrials and even being allowed to steer and fly the ship a little bit, and then being cared for and taken back after about 5 days, which is not atypical for watching someone after they've had an electrical shock like that. It was quite an accidental thing that happened, I'm convinced, from studying the case personally as a medical doctor and as a scientist. And yet what it was portrayed to the public through this horrible movie, Fire in the Sky, was that he was tortured and abducted by these horrible aliens. Nothing could be further from the truth. So what I tell people is that we have to be very careful, and I think rather skeptical of these terrifying images and stories that we hear, because you can have a wonderful story that's a real contact event like Travis Walton has and have it spun by these spinmeisters and propaganda warfare experts into a horror story, or you can have a fake event like the Benowitz affair situation where they use an abduction as a cover story because someone saw something they didn't want them to see. And so the big question becomes, what is really behind all of this? And it gets back to what we were talking about half an hour ago, and that is, who benefits from fear? Who benefits by creating an enemy when there is none? Now, I recently, this was in the last 2 weeks, I had a conversation with a lieutenant colonel who, a medical doctor friend of the project, connected me to him, had been working during the Carter and Reagan years on the Star Wars programs, the SDI programs. And he was at a meeting at the Pentagon where it was talking about one of the uses of these Star Wars programs was to have them in the event of a, quote, a alien threat and a threat from outer space. Exactly what Wernher von Braun warned us was going to be hoaxed back before he passed away, and he told this information to Dr. Carol Rosin. Well, this man confirmed this, and he said at the time the sense he got from this meeting was that the people talking about that knew there was no threat, but wanted to present that as a specter, as sort of a hoax scenario to convince people, particularly Ronald Reagan and his folks, to spend the untold numbers of billions of dollars on weaponizing space and on the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And so this is the kind of manipulation that goes on. And it's not a small amount of money we're talking about, between keeping the subject secret to protect the petrodollar, oil, gas, coal, and utility interests, and the $1 trillion a year military-industrial laboratory corporate complex. We're talking real money. I mean, we're talking real power. But more importantly, we're talking about geopolitical power, because by manipulating masses of people, both the political system and the people out there, they can create a lot of centralized power because of fear. Because when people are afraid, they give up their liberties and they give up their freedoms to feel secure, to have Big Brother watch out over them. So that's a big part of the psychology behind this. And what's so amazing to me, and sometimes disillusioning, is the extent to which people who would otherwise be rational and even intellectual will get involved with this subject, and they will immediately take this hook, line, and sinker, all this fear and all this disinformation, without any discernment and with very, very little research. Recently, some of the people in the exopolitics, as it's called, field, has started putting out this information that there's one of these bad alien races that have a secret treaty with the secret government, where they made a deal to sell our women folk off and have genetic experiments in exchange for us getting their technology. Well, first of all, this is laughable, because the people who have seen, some of the people who come out of these secret programs who relate seeing these little creatures running around in underground bases, those aren't extraterrestrials. I call them aliens with quotes around them, meaning they're these man-made program life forms. But they wouldn't know that. A lot of people don't know this because they don't know of the compartmented operations. You have to cross all these compartments. And I was recently meeting with a CIA person in the Washington area and a Defense Intelligence Agency investigator on this issue. And they're so compartmentalized, and they have their own little domains that they have to stay in because of their security oaths, that even they don't know this stuff. And the lucky thing is for me is that because I'm a country doctor in Virginia who has taken no oath for security, I don't answer to any national security entity. I've been able to cross all these compartments and put this case together. And when they saw the briefing materials that I had put together on this, their mouths dropped open.